A vast and brilliant civilization vanished into the dust of history. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of humanity's first great urban experiments, built cities of stunning sophistication across a region larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. For centuries, its people thrived in meticulously planned metropolises, mastering water management and weaving a web of trade that stretched across the known world. Then their grand urban centers were quietly, mysteriously left behind. The great puzzle is not that they fell, but how a society of such scale and stability could simply unravel, leaving behind no clear story of its end. For decades, the dominant theories pointed to invasions or epic droughts, but these simple explanations have begun to crumble. By the end of this investigation, you will understand the revolutionary new model that explains this ancient disappearance, pieced together from clues hidden in bones, seeds, and ancient DNA. We are now learning this was not a sudden collapse, but a profound transformation. What does the slow fading of a superpower tell us about the fragility of our own world? Their story begins not with a bang, but with a slow, deliberate gathering of communities along the life-giving rivers of the Indus and Hakra. Around 3,300 years before our common era, something remarkable took root. Villagers began to share ideas, technologies, and a grand vision for living together. Over centuries, this network of settlements blossomed into one of the world's first and most expansive urban civilizations, a true superpower of its time. At its peak, its influence stretched over an area of more than 1 million square kilometers, a territory encompassing much of modern Pakistan and northwestern India. This was not a single kingdom, but a vast cultural sphere, a constellation of cities and towns bound by a shared way of life. What defined this civilization was a profound sense of order. Their greatest cities, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, were marvels of urban planning laid out on precise grid systems. Streets ran straight and wide, intersecting at perfect right angles, with entire neighborhoods dedicated to craftspeople and civic life. Beneath these orderly streets lay their most ingenious achievement, a complex, city-wide network of covered drains and sewers. Every home had access to running water and a private bathing area, with wastewater channeled away from living spaces, a level of public hygiene unmatched for thousands of years to come. This harmony extended to commerce and culture. Traders across this vast region used the same standardized weights made from carefully cut chert stone, ensuring fairness from the coast to the inland towns. They produced exquisite pottery, delicate beadwork from carnelian and lapis lazuli, and seals engraved with elegant animal motifs and a mysterious script. This writing system, found on thousands of small seals and tablets, remains one of history's great unsolved puzzles, a silent language that holds the secrets of their names, their beliefs, and their daily transactions. For nearly 2,000 years, this civilization demonstrated an astonishing stability. There is no evidence of grand palaces or monumental temples to warrior kings, no great hordes of weapons suggesting a society organized for constant war. Instead, the archaeology points to a prosperous, orderly, and deeply connected world. They traded with Mesopotamia for precious metals, with Afghanistan for gemstones, weaving a web of exchange that spanned continents. This was a long, golden age of innovation and coexistence, which makes the quiet emptiness that followed not just a mystery, but a profound loss. What could possibly cause such a resilient and brilliant society to gradually, but completely, let go of its greatest creations? The silence in the streets of Mohenjo-daro was not a dramatic event, but a slow accumulation of quiet. The great departure from the Indus Valley cities unfolded over centuries, a gradual process stretching from around 1900 to 1300 years before our Common Era. This was not an apocalypse with a clear date of destruction, but a prolonged fading, like a vibrant color slowly washing out of fabric. Archaeologists see this not in a single layer of ash or ruins, but in a subtle, heartbreaking series of changes within the soil. The first clue is in the bricks themselves, the meticulous city-wide drainage systems, that crowning achievement of public health, begin to show neglect. Drains clog and are not repaired, courtyards and public wells fall into disrepair. It speaks of a shift in priorities, a communal spirit that once maintained grandeur for all, gradually turning inward. The grand, standardized craftsmanship that defined their culture also begins to simplify. The intricate designs on pottery become less elaborate. The beautiful, standardized weights used for fair trade across vast distances become rarer, suggesting the long-distance networks that connected this civilization were fraying. Cities did not burn, they emptied. Neighborhoods were slowly abandoned, house by house. The archaeological layers show that later occupants sometimes reused materials from older, grander buildings, constructing smaller, less organized homes within the shells of the past. This gradual simplification of life is perhaps the most telling evidence. The material culture, the physical expression of a society's complexity and unity, was becoming more localized, more basic. This slow fade is actually more puzzling than a sudden catastrophe. A flood, a war leaves clear scars, but a civilization choosing, over generations, to walk away from its greatest achievements presents a deeper mystery. What changes in the world or in the minds of a people makes the upkeep of a miracle seem no longer worth the effort? The search for an answer led scholars down two major paths for decades, toward theories of dramatic conflict and climatic disaster. For a long time, historians sought a single, catastrophic event to explain this great fading. The most dramatic explanation, popular for much of the 20th century, was the story of an invasion. This theory suggested that waves of nomadic pastoralists, often referred to as the Aryans, swept down from the northwest with horse-drawn chariots and superior weapons, violently overthrowing the peaceful urban dwellers. It was a compelling narrative of conflict, a clash of civilizations that fit older historical models. Yet when archaeologists meticulously sifted through the layers of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, they found a puzzling absence. There were no great burning layers, no mass deposits of weapons, no clear evidence of fortified walls built in haste against a new enemy. The material record simply did not support a story of sudden, violent conquest. While cultural change certainly occurred, the theory of a swift military overthrow began to crumble under the weight of silent stones and orderly bricks. Another major theory pointed not to human conflict but to an environmental catastrophe. This hypothesis focused on the lifeblood of the civilization, its rivers. Researchers noted that many major settlements were built along the Gaga-Hakra river system, which today is a seasonal stream. The idea was that a massive tectonic shift, perhaps an earthquake, caused the rivers to change course or simply dry up. Without a reliable water source for irrigation, the agricultural foundation of the society would have crumbled, forcing populations to abandon their cities in search of water. This river diversion theory provided a clear, almost mechanical cause for collapse. It made intuitive sense, a civilization betrayed by the very geography that nurtured it. Yet, like the invasion theory, it began to seem too neat, too singular. Later geological studies would reveal a more complex story of climate interplay, suggesting the rivers did not vanish overnight in a single cataclysm, but responded to broader, slower changes in the environment. These early theories were foundational, the necessary first steps in solving a profound mystery. They gave us a framework of questions, asking if the end came from outside forces or from within the landscape itself. But they shared a common flaw, a desire for a simple story with a clear villain, be it human or natural. The reality of the Indus Valley's transformation, as newer research is revealing, refuses to fit into such a tidy box. The truth appears far more intricate, a tapestry woven from many threads of change pulling slowly at the fabric of society. If it wasn't a sudden invasion or a single drought, what subtle, compounding pressures could persuade an entire civilization to gradually walk away from everything it had built? The real story of the end is written not in broken bricks, but in ancient mud and deep-sea silt. Modern science has turned to paleoclimatology, the study of ancient weather, to read this forgotten chapter. By analyzing sediment cores from the Arabian Sea and lake beds, and studying mineral isotopes in stalagmites from Himalayan caves, researchers have uncovered a profound environmental shift. The data reveals a clear, troubling trend. Starting around 4,200 years ago, the Great Monsoon system that watered the Indus heartland began to weaken. Rains became less reliable, and the climate grew gradually more arid over centuries. This was not a single catastrophic drought, but a slow, relentless drying. For a civilization engineered around predictable water, this was a creeping crisis. The life-giving rivers, dependent on monsoon-fed glaciers and rainfall, would have carried less water each year. Canals ran dry, water tables dropped, and the agricultural surplus that fed massive cities began to dwindle. A society built on abundance was now facing a new reality of scarcity. The stress would have been immense but not immediate. One failed harvest could be survived, 2 or 3 might strain community stores, but generation after generation of tightening constraints would force impossible choices. Do you keep maintaining the grand civic drain when your family's field is parched? Do you trade for luxuries when ensuring basic sustenance becomes the daily struggle? This long environmental squeeze did not cause a sudden collapse, but it began to pull apart the very foundations of urban life. The brilliant, interconnected system that was the Indus civilization required a constant, abundant flow of resources. As that flow diminished, the logic of living in such large, concentrated cities began to fade with it. People did not vanish, they adapted. The archaeological record suggests a gradual movement, a dispersal of populations away from the great urban centers toward the east and south, into regions with more reliable rainfall or smaller, more manageable river systems. They took their culture, their skills, and their identity with them, but they no longer invested them in maintaining the old, water-intensive urban model. This climatic shift provides the crucial backdrop, the changing stage upon which the final acts of this civilization were played out. It was the pervasive pressure that made every other challenge harder to bear. Yet, even this powerful explanation is not the full picture. Climate change set the scene, but it was the human response, the social and economic choices made in the face of that change, that truly wrote the ending. How does a society's internal fabric begin to fray when the world around it slowly becomes more harsh? The weakening monsoons did not act alone. Modern archaeology has moved beyond the search for a single, dramatic cause, recognizing that the Indus Valley's transformation was the result of a perfect storm of interlinked pressures. Think of climate change not as a lone villain, but as a relentless threat multiplier. It took every existing strain within this vast society and made it worse, accelerating a chain reaction that ultimately made urban life unsustainable. This is the essence of the new multi-causal model. The civilization was a complex, interconnected system, and when its environmental foundation began to shift, it placed immense stress on every other pillar holding it up. The economic networks that depended on predictable agricultural surplus began to falter. As harvests grew less reliable in the core regions, the long-distance trade in luxury goods and essential materials like timber or metal ores would have become more difficult and less profitable. The beautiful, standardized weights found across the region become less common in this later period, a tangible clue that the trust and coordination required for such far-flung commerce were breaking down. Socially, the shared identity and cooperative spirit that built those magnificent cities may have frayed under the strain of scarcity. When resources dwindle, communities can turn inward, prioritizing local or family survival over grand civic projects. The neglected drains and wells are not just signs of economic hardship, they are symbols of a fading collective purpose. Politically, while we do not see evidence of kings or emperors, the civilization must have had some form of administrative elite to coordinate city planning, trade, and resource distribution. A prolonged environmental crisis would have challenged the authority and capability of any governing system, potentially leading to a loss of faith in the established order. These factors, environmental, economic, social, and political, fed into each other, creating a feedback loop of de-urbanization. As cities became harder to maintain, people left. As people left, the tax base or labor pool for maintenance shrank, making cities even less functional, which encouraged more people to leave. It was a slow, reinforcing cycle of dispersal. This multi-causal view transforms the narrative from a sudden collapse to a prolonged societal adaptation. The people were not passively wiped out, they were actively making difficult choices in response to a changing world. But to truly understand these choices, we must look closer at the most intimate evidence left behind, the very seeds they planted and the bones they laid to rest. What do these silent remains tell us about their final days in the once great cities? To solve a mystery this ancient, we need more than just shovels and brushes. The real breakthroughs are now coming from a quiet technological revolution in the lab. A new generation of tools is letting archaeologists peer through time in ways once thought impossible, asking questions of the past that we could never ask before. Take the very ground the cities are buried in. Using ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR, which is like a laser scanner from an aircraft, researchers can now map entire buried street plans and structures without ever breaking the soil. It reveals the ghostly outlines of forgotten neighborhoods, showing how a city grew and changed over centuries, all from the surface. This allows us to see the civilization not as a static ruin, but as a living, evolving organism. Even more intimate clues come from the smallest of remains. Through isotopic analysis, scientists can now study the chemistry locked inside ancient bones and teeth. By analyzing the isotopes in human and animal remains, they can reconstruct detailed life stories. They can tell what a person ate, whether their diet was rich in millet or wheat, and even detect if they drank water from a different region, revealing patterns of individual migration. This transforms anonymous skeletons into individuals with personal histories, showing us movement and connection on a human scale. Similarly, advanced analysis of pottery, examining microscopic residues and clay sourcing, can trace a single pot's journey from its village workshop to a distant city market, mapping the ebb and flow of trade networks. These are not just tools for finding more artifacts, they are instruments for listening to the past in a new language. They shift the focus from cataloging objects to understanding lives, from asking what happened to asking how people experienced their changing world. This scientific lens is now focused on one of the most direct forms of evidence we have, the biological remains of the civilization itself, and what it reveals is rewriting the story of their final chapter. The most personal stories of the Indus people are written in the chemistry of their bones. Scientists now use a technique called isotopic analysis, which acts like a biological time capsule, to read the life history of an individual from their skeletal remains. By measuring tiny, natural variations in elements like strontium, oxygen, and carbon preserved in tooth enamel and bone, researchers can answer questions that artifacts alone cannot. Where did this person grow up? What did they eat throughout their life? Did they move from one region to another? This turns anonymous remains from a cemetery into a biography written in atoms. The findings from sites like Harappa are quietly revolutionary. Strontium isotopes, which vary by geology, act as a geographic fingerprint. Analysis shows that a significant number of individuals buried in the city were not born there. Their teeth, which form in childhood and lock in the chemistry of their early environment, tell a story of origin in a different region entirely. This is direct proof of long-term life cycle migration. People were moving, not fleeing in panic, but as part of a sustained pattern of mobility and interconnection across the civilization. Oxygen isotopes, which reflect the water a person drank, further support this, revealing that some residents consumed water from distinct climatic zones. Even more telling are the dietary shifts captured by carbon and nitrogen isotopes. These elements reveal the proportion of different kinds of plants and animal protein in a person's diet over the last decade or so of their life. Studies indicate that as time went on, some populations showed a marked increase in their consumption of drought-resistant crops like millet, alongside a continued reliance on animals. This is not a story of starvation or a desperate, last-resort food source. It is evidence of conscious, successful adaptation. Communities were shifting their agricultural strategies, incorporating hardier grains that required less water in direct response to the changing climate. They were not passive victims of a collapse, they were active problem solvers, altering their subsistence base to survive and even thrive under new conditions. These isotopic biographies complicate the old narrative of a sudden, uniform downfall. Instead, they paint a picture of resilience and flexibility. Some people moved to where resources were more reliable. Others changed what they grew and ate. The civilization did not vanish in a moment. It transformed through thousands of individual and community decisions made over generations. The grand urban model became less viable, but the people, their knowledge, and their culture persisted in new forms. This biological evidence forces us to ask a bigger question. If the people were adapting so effectively, what finally caused the brilliant idea of the city itself to be abandoned for good? The silent archives of the Indus are not just in stone and bone, but in the very soil they tilled. Archaeobotany, the study of ancient plant remains, allows us to read the civilization's agricultural diary, a record written in charred seeds and microscopic silica skeletons called phytoliths. What we find is a portrait of a farming system of remarkable intelligence and foresight. This was not a society dependent on a single miracle crop. Instead, they practiced a sophisticated, multi-season agriculture that hedged against risk. In the winter, they cultivated wheat and barley, relying on moisture retained in the soil. When summer arrived, they switched to drought-tolerant crops like millets, sorghum, and pulses, which could thrive on monsoon rains. This seasonal rhythm meant food could be produced year-round, a brilliant buffer against the failure of any one harvest. It was a system built for stability in a land of seasonal variation, a testament to deep environmental knowledge passed down through generations. The later chapters of this botanical record, however, tell a story of deliberate adaptation. As the climate data suggests the monsoons weakened and grew less reliable, the plant remains from archaeological sites show a telling shift. The proportion of drought-resistant millets like pearl millet and sorghum increases significantly in the later periods. This is not a sign of cultural decline, but of agricultural innovation under pressure. Farmers were consciously selecting and promoting the crops that had the best chance of survival in a drier world. They were adapting their portfolio, so to speak, moving investments from more water-intensive grains to more resilient ones. This shift in what was grown likely triggered a parallel shift in how and where people lived. Millets are hardy, but they generally yield less per acre than wheat or barley under ideal conditions. Supporting a dense, massive urban population requires a huge, predictable surplus, the kind generated by winter cereals grown with reliable water. As the climate made those large surpluses harder to guarantee, the economic logic of the giant city began to weaken. The move toward millets fits perfectly with a broader societal movement toward smaller, more dispersed rural communities. A village can sustain itself on a mix of local crops and animal husbandry far more easily than a metropolis of tens of thousands can. The seeds tell us that the people were not abandoning agriculture, they were refining it for a new reality. They were trading the grand scale required by urban life for a more resilient, localized subsistence. The great cities were not overthrown, they were gradually rendered obsolete by a changing environment and the smart, pragmatic choices of the farmers who once fed them. This botanical evidence completes a powerful picture. We see a civilization responding to pressure not with a single dramatic decision, but with thousands of quiet, intelligent adaptations in fields and kitchens across the land. Even the animals that lived alongside them have a story to tell. The study of ancient animal remains, known as zooarchaeology, offers a unique window into the daily life and economy of the Indus Valley people. By examining the bones found in trash heaps, butchering areas, and ceremonial sites, researchers can reconstruct what animals they raised, hunted, and revered. The picture that emerges is one of a society deeply connected to its livestock, with a relationship that subtly shifted as the centuries wore on. The undisputed star of the Indus barnyard was the cow, or more specifically, cattle like the humped zebu. Their bones are found in overwhelming numbers at nearly every site. They provided the fundamental pillars of the economy: meat and milk for sustenance, hides for leather, and immense muscle power for plowing fields and pulling carts. They were the living engines of agriculture and transport. But another animal held a place of almost equal importance: the water buffalo. Larger and stronger than cattle, the water buffalo was likely the primary beast of burden for heavy work, and its bones show it was also a major source of meat. The prevalence of both animals speaks to a society that mastered complex herd management, balancing different species for different needs. Yet, as with the crops and the people, the animal bones record a period of change. In the later phases of the civilization, there is intriguing evidence in the skeletal remains. The size and age patterns of the cattle herds appear to shift. Some studies suggest animals were being slaughtered at younger ages. This could point to several adaptations, perhaps a move toward more immediate meat production in uncertain times, or a change in pasture management as the landscape grew drier. Alongside this, there is a noticeable increase in the bones of wild animals like deer and various river fish. This is a subtle but significant clue. When a highly organized urban society begins to rely more on hunting and fishing, it often signals that the structured agricultural system is loosening its grip. It is not a sign of desperation but of diversification. People were supplementing their managed herds with resources from the wild, becoming less exclusively dependent on the large-scale, settled farming that supported city life. This shift in the animal economy mirrors the changes seen in crops and human movement. It paints a portrait of a society becoming more flexible, more localized, and more directly tied to the immediate environment. The great, integrated economic machine was decentralizing, breaking down into smaller, self-reliant units. The story told by these ancient bones is not one of a sudden breakdown, but of a gradual, strategic recalibration of an entire way of life. Their mastery of water was the very signature of their genius. For decades, we marveled at the intricate drains and wells within cities like Mohenjo-daro, but we were only seeing the final chapter of their hydraulic story, the urban endpoint of a much larger and more ancient conversation with a thirsty landscape. New archaeological surveys using satellite imagery and ground exploration are now revealing the true scale of their water management, a vast network of infrastructure that stretched far beyond city walls. Across the arid regions of Gujarat and Rajasthan, researchers have mapped extensive systems of check dams. cleverly designed stone barriers built across seasonal streams to slow monsoon runoff, trap precious silt, and recharge groundwater. They have identified sophisticated reservoirs and tanks, like the magnificent series of interconnected, stone-lined reservoirs at the coastal city of Dholavira, which captured every drop of rain that fell on its citadel. This was not a civilization merely blessed by rivers. It was a civilization of hydrological engineers, actively sculpting their environment to capture, store, and conserve water on a monumental scale. This discovery fundamentally changes the puzzle of their end. The old theory of a single river drying up and causing instant collapse now seems far too simplistic. Here was a society that had spent centuries anticipating water scarcity, that had built redundant systems and backup plans into the very fabric of their territory. They were experts at managing variability. The question then becomes not whether they faced drought, but what magnitude of sustained change could possibly overwhelm an entire culture of water experts. Their elaborate systems required constant, coordinated maintenance, a shared social commitment to dredging reservoirs and repairing dams. As the climate stress intensified over generations, the labor and organization needed to keep this vast network functioning may have become unsustainable, especially as populations began to disperse. The very complexity of their solution may have contained the seeds of its own unraveling. When a society's survival depends on a high-maintenance system, and that system is pushed beyond its design limits by a changing world, the result is not a sudden break, but a slow, exhausting retreat. Their brilliant adaptation to a dry land may have ultimately defined the limits of their urban dream. Their cities were connected to a world far beyond the Indus Valley. This civilization was not an isolated island of genius, but a central hub in a vast web of ancient globalization. Their merchants and sailors forged links that stretched across staggering distances, from the bustling cities of Mesopotamia in the west to the resource-rich highlands of Central Asia and the shores of the Persian Gulf. This trade was not a luxury, it was a vital artery pumping wealth, ideas, and prestige into the heart of their society. The evidence for this network is scattered across continents, a trail of breadcrumbs left by commerce. In the ruins of Mesopotamian cities like archaeologists have found the distinctive square seals of the Indus, carved with their mysterious script and unicorn-like creatures. Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets even refer to a distant land called Meluhha, a place of exotic goods which scholars widely believe was the Indus Valley itself. From Meluhha, they imported carnelian beads with dazzling white patterns, intricately carved ivory combs, and prized woods like teak. In return, the Indus received silver, gold, tin, and perhaps most importantly, the beautiful blue stone lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan. To ensure fairness across this vast economic space, they used those remarkable standardized weights, made from chert stone in precise ratios. A merchant in the port of Lothal on the Arabian Sea and a trader in the inland city of Harappa could conduct business using the same trusted measures, a system that created incredible commercial cohesion. This long-distance trade created wealth that supported entire classes of urban specialists, the master bead makers, the seal carvers, the metal workers, and the administrators who coordinated it all. It was a pillar of their sophisticated urban economy, but a web so vast is also fragile, sensitive to tremors anywhere along its strands, and in the centuries of the Indus transformation, tremors were shaking their most important partners. Around the same time, the monsoons were weakening in South Asia. The powerful Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, a major trading partner, was itself collapsing under severe drought and social upheaval. The Persian Gulf region, a crucial maritime corridor, also shows signs of political fragmentation. Imagine the chain reaction. As climate stress hit Mesopotamia, its demand for luxury imports from distant Meluhha would have plummeted. Political instability along the Gulf made sea routes riskier and more expensive to navigate. Suddenly, the elaborate, long-distance exchange that brought raw materials to Indus workshops and sent finished goods to foreign elites began to seize up. The economic rationale for concentrated craft specialization in big cities eroded. Why live in an urban center to carve beads for a foreign market that no longer exists? The unraveling of these trade networks was a slow, silent pressure, but a deeply consequential one. It removed a key source of wealth and social glue, making the challenging work of maintaining those grand, water-intensive cities seem less and less worthwhile. The world, it seemed, was closing in, encouraging people to look locally for solutions rather than globally for opportunity. The most profound mystery of the Indus Valley may not be its script, but its silence on power. Where other ancient civilizations shouted their hierarchies in stone, the Indus whispers. There are no towering ziggurats dedicated to a sun god, no sprawling palace complexes walled off from the common people, no lavishly furnished royal tombs filled with gold and sacrificed servants. The architecture, instead, speaks of a remarkable focus on civic welfare and communal living. The largest structures unearthed are not temples or palaces, but the Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, likely used for communal rituals, and massive granaries for storing the harvest. This striking absence has led many scholars to describe the Indus as seemingly more egalitarian, a society where authority was distributed differently. It suggests a political and social order unlike the divine kings of Egypt or the warrior rulers of Mesopotamia. The question is, what kind of governance built these marvelously planned cities without leaving a clear signature of a single ruler? The leading theory today points not to a hierarchy with a king at the top, but to a heterarchy, a system where power was shared among different groups, perhaps merchant guilds, religious leaders, and neighborhood elders, all cooperating to manage the complex needs of the city. Think of it not as a pyramid, but as a network, a council of experts each responsible for their domain, water management, trade, craft production, and civic ritual, working in concert. This corporate model of governance helps explain the incredible standardization in bricks, weights, and city layouts. It was the product of strong social consensus and shared technical knowledge, not the decree of a single autocrat. Such a system is brilliantly resilient to certain kinds of stress. It can adapt, it can share burdens, and it lacks a single point of failure. But this very strength may have contained a hidden vulnerability when faced with the kind of slow, grinding pressure the civilization eventually encountered. A corporate system relies on continuous cooperation, trust, and a shared belief in the common project. When the monsoons weakened for centuries, when trade networks frayed, and when maintaining the grand urban infrastructure became a relentless, exhausting burden, what happens to that consensus? In a kingdom, a pharaoh could command labor to dredge a canal or rebuild a dam, using centralized authority to force a solution. In a hierarchical network, that decision requires negotiation, agreement, and voluntary contribution from multiple independent groups. As resources dwindled and life grew harder, the incentive for each group to prioritize its own survival over the costly upkeep of the shared urban dream would have grown stronger. The social contract, woven over 1,000 years of abundance, would have slowly unraveled. The neglected drains and the simpler pottery are not just signs of economic hardship, they are archaeological footprints of a fading collective will. The system did not collapse because its leader was defeated. It transformed because the agreement that held it together gradually, silently, dissolved. People did not rebel against a king. They simply stopped believing the city was worth the immense effort it now demanded. This makes their departure not a failure of leadership, but a quiet, collective choice to pursue a different, more sustainable way of life. Yet one of their most famous creations offers no answers, only a deeper silence. Among the thousands of artifacts recovered from the Indus Valley, The most captivating are the small, square seals, often carved with elegant animal figures and a series of mysterious symbols. This is their script, and it remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of the ancient world. We have examples of it, but we cannot read a single word. This unbroken code means we are missing the civilization's own voice, its names, its laws, its stories, and its prayers. Without it, we are left to interpret their entire world through objects and architecture alone, like trying to understand a modern city by only studying its sewer system and the shapes of its street signs. The script's undeciphered nature creates a profound gap in our knowledge, especially when we try to understand how their society was administered or what shared beliefs held it together. In a civilization with no obvious palaces or temples, written records would tell us who organized the grain stores, how trade contracts were enforced, or what rituals were performed in the Great Bath. This silence limits our view of their identity at the very moment it may have been changing. Intriguingly, the script itself seems to tell a story of fading cohesion. In the later periods, researchers note that the use of writing appears to become less standardized. The inscriptions grow shorter, and they appear on different types of objects, suggesting its function in society was shifting. One compelling theory is that the script was primarily an administrative tool for managing the complex, long-distance trade and civic coordination that defined their urban golden age. As those trade networks broke down and cities dispersed, the need for such a formal, widespread writing system would have diminished. When you no longer need to send sealed orders for carnelian beads to a port city or record large grain transactions for a central warehouse, the practical urgency behind maintaining a uniform script fades. Its gradual simplification and eventual disappearance could reflect a broader social shift, a move from a large, integrated cultural identity to smaller, more localized and self-sufficient communities. In these smaller groups, communication could be oral and face-to-face, making a complex written system unnecessary. The fading of the script, then, might be the clearest archaeological signature of the fading of the idea that bound them all together, the idea that they were part of something vast and unified. It is a haunting thought that the very tool meant to preserve their memory became a symbol of its quiet unraveling. The story of their departure changes dramatically when you look beyond the great river plains. While the iconic cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa in the central Indus Valley were gradually emptying, life was taking a different turn in other parts of their vast territory. This is the crucial evidence that shatters the idea of a single, uniform collapse. Instead of a blanket disappearance, we see a fascinating process of regional diversification, a civilization breaking apart into distinct cultural streams that adapted to their local environments. In the rugged, coastal region of Gujarat, for example, the story is one of remarkable persistence. Major sites like Dholavira and Lothal show signs of continued, vibrant occupation long after the central cities began to fade. At Lothal, a famous port and bead-making center, archaeologists see no evidence of a sudden end. Instead, they find layers of continuous rebuilding and adaptation. The craft traditions, especially the intricate working of carnelian stone into beautiful etched beads, not only continued but in some ways reached new heights of skill. This wasn't a community clinging to a dead past, it was a thriving node of culture evolving on its own terms, sustained by maritime trade and local resources. Similarly, in the foothills of the Himalayas, settlements show a clear continuity of Indus material culture, blending with local styles to create something new. These communities, often in areas with more reliable rainfall, became pockets where the old ways were preserved and remixed. They used similar pottery designs, maintained some craft techniques, and likely upheld social and ritual practices inherited from their ancestors, but they did so within smaller, more manageable villages rather than grand metropolises. This regional picture forces a complete rethink of the narrative. What looks from the center like an abandonment looks from the periphery like a reorganization. The great unified cultural sphere was fragmenting, not vanishing. The shared symbols, weights, and city plans that once connected a superpower gave way to more localized expressions. People stopped building in the grand, water-intensive Indus style, not because they forgot how, but because it no longer suited their new realities. They took the core of their knowledge, their agricultural practices, their craft skills, and their social structures, and they transplanted them into different soils. The civilization did not die, it decentralized. Its brilliance was not lost but disseminated, flowing into the cultural foundations of the subcontinent that would follow. This transforms the entire mystery from a tragic ending into a story of profound cultural transformation. If the people and their knowledge persisted, then where did they ultimately go, and what legacy did they leave in the world that came after them? Mohenjo-daro stands as the perfect monument to a slow goodbye. While its name means Mound of the Dead, the city's final chapters were not written in a single catastrophe, but in layers of quiet adaptation and gradual letting go. Archaeologists reading these layers from the deepest, oldest foundations to the most recent surfaces see a story of urban life gently winding down over generations. The city did not fall, it faded. In its later periods, the signature order that defined the Indus genius begins to blur. The most telling evidence comes from the neighborhoods themselves. In areas that were once meticulously planned with uniform brick houses and wide streets, later residents began to make alterations. They partitioned large courtyards into smaller rooms, a sign of changing family structures or new economic realities. More strikingly, they sometimes built new, smaller houses directly on top of the ruins of older, grander structures, reusing the old bricks but without the original precision. These new homes often ignored the strict street grid, their walls cutting across the ancient right angles. This is a profound shift. It represents a move away from communal city planning toward individual, immediate need. The shared blueprint was being forgotten, one renovation at a time. The quality of construction itself tells a story of diminishing resources or collective will. Repairs to walls and drains were made with inferior materials, mud brick replacing the once universal, high-quality baked brick. The great civic infrastructure, that masterpiece of public health, began to suffer from neglect. Drains that required regular communal cleaning to function were left to clog. Wells in public courtyards fell into disrepair. This neglect is not necessarily a sign of poverty, but a shift in priority. Maintaining a city-wide system requires a shared belief in the city itself, a commitment to the common good. As that belief waned, attention turned inward, to the survival of the household rather than the glory of the metropolis. Perhaps the most symbolic change of all is found in the use of public space. In the city's later layers, archaeologists have found evidence of small, crude kilns or craft workshops built right in the middle of what were once open courtyards or broad streets. These spaces, designed for civic gathering and grand processions, were being repurposed for small-scale private industry. The very idea of public space, so central to the city's original design, was being overwritten by the pragmatic demands of daily life. This transformation at Mohenjo-daro is a microcosm of the entire civilization's journey. It shows us depopulation not as a sudden exodus, but as a gradual thinning, a failure to replenish. It shows us the loss of civic order not through rebellion, but through 1,000 small decisions to prioritize the personal over the communal. The city became a quieter, simpler, more fragmented place until one day the last family gathered their belongings, walked out past the silent great bath, and did not return. Their footsteps left no echo, only a puzzle in the dust for us to ponder millennia later. Harappa tells a different story. While Mohenjo-daro faded into quiet simplicity, its great sister city to the north reveals a more dynamic, resilient chapter in the civilization's final act. Here, the archaeological layers do not show a gentle surrender to the elements, but a determined, even defiant, adaptation to a changing world. This is not a tale of disappearance, but of transformation, proving that some urban hearts kept beating long after the old rhythms were gone. The evidence lies in a profound shift in the city's very silhouette. In the later centuries, as the wider civilization was dispersing, the people of Harappa undertook a massive construction project. They built a fortified citadel, a raised, walled area that stood distinct from the rest of the settlement. This was a dramatic departure from the classic Indus aesthetic, which had famously lacked obvious defensive walls and military architecture. The decision to build such a prominent fortification speaks volumes about a new reality. It suggests a world where security could no longer be taken for granted, where the old, open confidence of the Indus era had given way to a need for protection and defined boundaries. This was not a sign of collapse but of reorganization, a community actively restructuring its space for a more uncertain age. Within these changing walls, daily life carried on, but it carried on differently. The pottery from these later levels tells a story of cultural conversation. The classic Indus forms, the elegant jars and painted dishes, begin to appear alongside entirely new styles. These new pots feature different shapes, fresh decorative motifs like geometric bands and stylized peacocks and novel techniques. This isn't a decline in craftsmanship, it's an evolution of taste. Archaeologists interpret this blend as evidence of new people arriving in the area, or of sustained contact with communities from the northwest, perhaps bringing their own traditions with them. The material culture becomes a fusion, a hybrid of enduring Indus practices and incoming ideas. This blending is crucial. It challenges the outdated notion of a violent invasion that wiped the slate clean. Instead, we see integration, a slow merging of traditions that created something new. Harappa was not being erased, it was being remixed. Perhaps most telling are the continuities that persist amidst the change. Even as new pottery styles appeared, many core Indus technologies and practices showed remarkable endurance. The art of making beautiful carnelian beads, a signature Indus craft, continued. Certain ritual objects and figurines, like the iconic female terracotta figures, remained in production, suggesting a persistence of spiritual or cultural beliefs. Life in Harappa was changing, but it was not starting over from nothing. The city became a living archive of its own past while actively engaging with a new present. This portrait of Harappa as a resilient, adapting urban center completely reframes the civilization's end. It shows that the response to the great pressures of climate and trade disruption was not uniform. Some cities, like Mohenjo-daro, gently dissipated. Others, like Harappa, hunkered down, reinforced their position, and opened their doors to new influences. There was no single fate, no clean break, but a spectrum of survival strategies. If Harappa could evolve so dramatically, then where did the people who ultimately left the cities go, and what became of the brilliant ideas they carried with them? While the great cities of the river plains grew quiet, a different story was unfolding 1,000 kilometers to the southeast. On the arid peninsula of Gujarat, jutting into the Arabian Sea, the Indus way of life demonstrated a stubborn and brilliant resilience. This region, with its unique ecology of coastal plains, seasonal rivers, and scrub forest, became a kind of refuge, a place where the old traditions not only survived but evolved long after the urban heartbeat had faded in the core. Here, the civilization did not collapse. It adapted with remarkable ingenuity to a landscape that demanded a different kind of mastery. The evidence for this endurance is etched into the stones of Dholavira and woven into the very fabric of smaller, countless settlements across the region. At Dholavira, a city built on a rocky island in the salt marshes of the Rann of Kutch, we see Indus urban planning pushed to its logical extreme in a water-scarce environment. The city's most stunning feature is its cascading series of 16 reservoirs, carved into the bedrock and lined with stone, designed to capture every possible drop of monsoon rain. This was hydrological engineering as an art form, a testament to a society that could tailor its grand principles to a local challenge. Crucially, Dholavira shows clear signs of occupation and active modification for centuries after Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were waning. The city was not abandoned in a single moment. It shrank, changed, and persisted, its later inhabitants still using and adapting the monumental water systems their ancestors built. This longevity points to Gujarat's ecological advantage. Its fate was not tied to the faltering monsoons of the Indus Valley to the north. Its survival depended on a different calculus, one of coastal resources, localized rainfall capture, and maritime trade. Along the coast, at places like the port of Lothal and a network of smaller sites, life thrived on connection to the sea. Lothal's famous dockyard, whether used for berthing ships or as a tidal reservoir for irrigation, symbolizes this maritime orientation. Long after overland trade routes to Mesopotamia grew quiet, the communities of Gujarat likely maintained coastal and Arabian Sea networks, exchanging shells, timber, and the region's famous carnelian beads for goods from elsewhere. The craft of making those exquisite etched carnelian beads, a signature Indus technology, did not die out here, it flourished. Workshops have been found in small villages, not just big cities, showing this specialized knowledge had dispersed and become a sustaining local industry. What emerges is a picture of a region that successfully decentralized the Indus model. Without the need to support massive, dense cities, communities could sustain a modified version of the culture, one focused on local resource management, skilled craftsmanship, and maritime links. They lived in smaller, more numerous settlements, often near the coast or seasonal water sources, each a resilient node in a looser network. Gujarat became a living archive, a place where the spirit of the civilization, its practical intelligence and adaptive spirit, found a new home long after its original urban form had receded into history. This regional survival forces us to ask, if the culture could persist so tenaciously in one corner of its vast territory, what traces of its essence might have flowed into the cultural currents that followed across the entire subcontinent? The final answers to an ancient mystery often lie in the most intimate of places. At the vast site of Rakhigarhi, one of the largest cities of the Indus Valley, archaeologists uncovered not just more streets and houses, but a quiet resting place, a cemetery holding the physical remains of the people who built this world. For decades, the secrets locked within their bones were inaccessible, but a new scientific frontier has changed everything. The revolutionary field of ancient DNA analysis has finally given us a direct, biological window into their identity, and what it reveals overturns a century of assumptions. In a landmark study, scientists successfully extracted and sequenced genetic material from individuals buried at Rakhigarhi. The results were definitive and startling. These people possessed a distinct genetic profile, a deep ancestry rooted in the ancient populations of South Asia. Crucially, their DNA showed no significant trace of ancestry from the pastoralist groups of the Eurasian steppe, the very groups historically linked to later Indo-European migrations into the region. This single finding is a seismic shift in our understanding. It critically undermines the old Aryan invasion theory, which relied on the idea of a massive, incoming population replacing the existing one. The genetics tell a different story, one of profound indigenous continuity. The people of the Indus Valley were not replaced by outsiders, they were the primary ancestors of the region. This transforms the entire conversation about their disappearance. If their biological lineage shows no major interruption from outside, then the forces that changed their society must be sought within. The focus shifts decisively from mythical invaders to the internal and environmental processes we have been tracing: the slow stress of climate, the fraying of trade, the quiet unraveling of social consensus. The silent individuals of Rakhigarhi have spoken through their genes, not with a story of conquest, but with a testament of enduring presence. Their legacy was not erased, it was transformed, flowing into the genetic and cultural tapestry of South Asia itself. The bones and the genes tell a clear story of movement, not extinction. This was not a panicked exodus, but a slow, strategic dispersal, a civilization changing its shape to fit a changing world. The isotopic signatures in teeth show individuals who spent their childhoods in different regions, proof of sustained migration. The ancient DNA confirms these were indigenous people, their lineage deeply rooted in the land. So where did they go when the great cities became too difficult to maintain? The evidence points not to one destination, but to many, following the logic of water and opportunity. A significant population likely shifted eastward over generations into the fertile Gangetic Plain, a region with more reliable rainfall. Others moved south onto the Deccan Plateau, adapting their farming to its different soils and seasons. The most common movement, however, was probably the shortest, from the massive, demanding urban centers back out into the countryside, into smaller, sustainable villages that were already part of the Indus network. This was a return to a more flexible, rural lifeway. Instead of relying on a complex, city-based economy, communities could focus on local farming, herding, and craft production. A family might still make beautiful pottery or beads, but for their neighbors and a local market, not for a vast export trade. This dispersal was a brilliant adaptation to ecological and economic pressure. It traded the vulnerabilities of a centralized system for the resilience of a distributed one. If one village faced hardship, it was not a catastrophe for the entire civilization. Knowledge, culture, and people simply flowed along these new, smaller channels, ensuring that the legacy of the Indus was not lost, but sown like seeds across a wider landscape. Their story did not end with the last family leaving a silent city. The quiet genius of the Indus Valley did not vanish into a historical dead end, but instead seeped into the very soil of the subcontinent, becoming a deep, foundational layer in the cultural bedrock of what would become India. This was not a replacement, but a profound and lasting assimilation, where their innovations and symbols were woven into the evolving tapestry of later civilizations. We can trace these threads of legacy in subtle but persistent ways, like faint but unmistakable patterns emerging through later layers of history. One of the most striking continuities lies in the realm of sacred symbols. The pipal tree, with its distinctive heart-shaped leaves, appears frequently on Indus seals, often depicted as a place of reverence or a cosmic axis. Thousands of years later, this same tree, known as the Ashvatha, holds a central and revered place in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions, celebrated as a symbol of enlightenment, longevity, and the interconnectedness of all life. Similarly, animals that held prominence on Indus seals, like the humped bull and the elephant, were later elevated to sacred status in the Hindu pantheon, with Nandi the bull as Shiva's vehicle and the elephant-headed Ganesha as the remover of obstacles. These are not likely coincidences, but echoes, suggesting that certain symbolic relationships with the natural world, first formalized in the Indus cities, retained their power and meaning across millennia, absorbed and reinterpreted by new cultural systems. The legacy is equally tangible in the mastery of materials. The Indus artisans were unparalleled bead makers, especially their work with carnelian, a hard stone they would heat, etch with alkaline paste, and polish into stunning white on red beads. This specific technological complex, this recipe for beauty, did not disappear. Centuries later, during the time of the Roman Empire, South Asia was still famous for exporting these very beads, produced in craft centers that had preserved and passed down the intricate knowledge. The tradition of advanced metallurgy, particularly in copper and bronze working, shows a similar thread of continuity. The techniques for casting, alloying, and creating fine artifacts developed in Indus workshops provided a technical foundation that later cultures built upon. Even the concept of standardized weights, so crucial for their trade, may have influenced later systems of measurement in the region, a principle of fair exchange that outlived the civilization that perfected it. Perhaps the most intriguing legacy lies in the possible absorption of ritual practices and cosmological ideas. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, with its precise geometry and sophisticated water management, strongly suggests a ritual or purification function centered on water. The importance of ritual bathing and the sanctity of water are, of course, central pillars of later Hindu practice. While we cannot draw a direct line, the architectural precedence is compelling. The emphasis on fertility, evidenced by numerous terracotta figurines of women, may have found resonance in later goddess traditions that flourished across the subcontinent. The overall lack of monumental temples in the Indus period does not mean an absence of spiritual thought. It suggests that ritual may have been more domestic or communal, a characteristic that also marks much of later Indian religious life. What this mosaic of continuities reveals is a civilization that underwent a metamorphosis. The grand, centralized urban expression faded, but the core cultural software, the symbols, technologies, and perhaps even spiritual intuitions were downloaded and reinstalled in new social hardware. The people did not forget who they were. They simply stopped building in the old way, allowing their heritage to flow into the streams of new communities and new ideas. This transforms their story from a tragic finale into one of immense cultural endurance, raising a final, profound question. What does the quiet persistence of this ancient world tell us about the true nature of historical change itself? One of the most dramatic theories for the city's end involves water, not its absence but its overwhelming return. The myth of a great, civilization-ending flood drowning Mohenjo-daro has captivated imaginations for decades. The visual is powerful, a thriving metropolis suddenly silenced beneath murky waters, a single cataclysm to explain the silence. This idea gained traction from early excavations, where archaeologists encountered thick layers of silt sandwiched between the city's occupational levels. These deposits of fine, water-laid sediment seem to tell a clear story. The Indus River had risen in fury, inundating the streets and forcing its people to flee. It was a neat, almost biblical explanation for the abandonment. The geological reality, however, is far more complex and less cinematic. Detailed studies of those very silt layers reveal a different pattern. They are not evidence of one apocalyptic deluge, but of multiple recurring flood events over the city's long history. Mohenjo-daro was built on a floodplain, a strategic yet vulnerable location. The layers show that its inhabitants were expert flood managers, not helpless victims. After a high water event, they would return, clean out the mud, repair the damage, and rebuild, often on top of the very silt that had covered their homes. This cycle of flooding and recovery was a chronic fact of life, a recurring environmental challenge they had learned to withstand. The critical point is that the final layers of occupation at Mohenjo-daro do not sit beneath a single, catastrophic silt deposit that marks an absolute end. Instead, the city's decline appears in layers of gradual decay and simplification that come after the last major flood sediments. The Great Flood, then, was not the final blow that killed the city, but one of the many persistent pressures that made urban life there increasingly difficult and costly to sustain. It was part of the background stress, a recurring test of their resilience that, over generations, may have finally tipped the balance against the immense effort of staying. The city did not drown in a day. It slowly decided the price of repeatedly bailing itself out was no longer worth paying. but even the sturdiest society can be challenged from within. Among the many pressures reshaping the Indus world, one factor is particularly difficult to trace, yet impossible to ignore: the silent threat of illness. The civilization's legendary sanitation, with its covered drains and private baths, was a monumental achievement in public health, a shield against the waterborne diseases that plagued other ancient cities. For centuries, this engineering likely granted them a remarkable advantage, fostering the population density and stability that defined their urban golden age. Yet this very strength may have contained a hidden vulnerability as conditions changed. In the later, declining phases of city life, as maintenance faltered and populations perhaps became more densely packed in shrinking urban cores, that shield could have cracked. Combine this with the broader environmental stress, where food security became a persistent worry. Periods of nutritional hardship, even if not outright famine, can weaken a community's resilience, making individuals more susceptible to infection. The result could have been a perfect storm for the spread of illness, where the very crowding that once signaled prosperity now facilitated the quiet, devastating work of contagion. Proving the presence of specific epidemics thousands of years ago is a formidable challenge for archaeology. Germs leave few direct traces in the soil. Yet, the conditions for such outbreaks become increasingly plausible within the model of a strained, transforming society. An increase in community illness would have acted as a powerful accelerant, deepening every other stress. It could sap the labor force needed for vital repairs, disrupt the social networks of care and trade, and erode the collective morale already tested by a changing climate. While we may never find the microscopic evidence of a specific pathogen, the potential for health crises remains a sobering piece of the puzzle, a reminder that civilizations are biological entities as much as cultural ones. Their endurance depends not just on strong walls and full granaries, but on the unseen well-being of every individual within them. This leads us to the final, overarching question: how do all these intertwined threads, from shifting monsoons to fraying trade, from resilient farmers to possible sickness, come together to explain not just an ending but a new beginning? The true rhythm of this transformation is now being measured with atomic precision. For decades, the timeline of the Indus Valley story was frustratingly vague, sketched in broad strokes of centuries. We spoke of a decline around 4,000 years ago, but such a wide window made it impossible to see cause and effect clearly. Did the cities empty before the monsoons weakened, or after? Did trade collapse first, or did social change lead the way? The answers were hidden in the imprecision of our own clocks. Today, a scientific revolution in dating is cutting through that fog, allowing us to reconstruct the past not in centuries but in generations. The key tool is radiocarbon dating, refined to extraordinary accuracy and supercharged by a statistical technique called Bayesian modeling. This approach doesn't just date a single seed or piece of charcoal, it analyzes hundreds of dates from across a site, using complex algorithms to filter out statistical noise and build a high-resolution chronological sequence. Think of it as turning a blurry historical photograph into a sharp, time-stamped film strip. What emerges is a timeline of stunning clarity, revealing that the so-called collapse was not a single event that happened everywhere at once, but a rolling, regional process. The new dates show that the great urban centers in the core regions, like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, began their gradual fade earlier, perhaps starting around 1900 years before our Common Era. Meanwhile, settlements in Gujarat and the eastern reaches show vibrant occupation for several more centuries. This asynchronicity is the death knell for simple, uniform collapse theories. It proves that communities in different ecological niches experience the pressures of climate change and social change on different schedules, and they responded in different ways. With this precise timeline in hand, researchers can now perform a kind of historical synchronization. They can line up the cultural layers from an archaeological dig, showing when pottery styles simplified or drains were neglected, directly alongside climate data from ocean cores and cave stalagmites that tell us exactly when monsoon rains became less reliable. The correlation is revealing. In region after region, the major shifts in material culture and urban maintenance align tightly with periods of heightened environmental stress. It is no longer a guess, it is a measurable relationship. This high-precision chronology transforms the entire narrative from a vague story of downfall into a detailed, procedural history. We are no longer just saying they declined, we are mapping how, when, and where different communities made the series of decisions that led them away from the urban ideal. It allows us to see their history not as a fate, but as a journey of countless human choices made within the changing boundaries of their world. A city without walls speaks volumes about its sense of security. For centuries, the classic Indus cities presented a remarkably open face to the world, their grandeur defined by wide streets and civic baths, not by towering ramparts or arsenals of war. This enduring peacefulness has long been a cornerstone of their mystery, making the search for conflict a critical line of inquiry. Did that tranquility finally shatter in their final centuries, or did the pressures of a changing world simply strain the social fabric from within? To answer this, we must look coldly at the evidence for violence, separating myth from the subtle clues in the ground. The archaeological record is searched for the universal fingerprints of warfare, fortifications, specialized weapons, human remains showing violent trauma, and clear layers of catastrophic burning. What we find is a mosaic, not a monolith. In the civilization's golden age, evidence for organized, large-scale conflict is strikingly absent. The cities were not designed as fortresses. While they had impressive citadel mounds, these elevated areas are generally interpreted as administrative or ritual centers, not military strongholds designed to repel armies. Their weaponry, too, was utilitarian, tools that could serve in hunting or defense, like copper axes and spear points, but not the specialized gear of a professional warrior class dedicated to conquest. The picture becomes more complex as we move into the later, transformative period. At some sites, we do see a shift. The most famous example is at Harappa, where, as we noted, a new, fortified citadel was constructed in the later phases. This is a significant change in the architectural language, a move toward defined, defensible space. Other sites show similar, though less dramatic, adaptations, like the reinforcing of gates or the construction of perimeter walls around neighborhoods. This suggests a world where the old, open confidence was giving way to a new caution, where local security could no longer be taken for granted. Yet, even with these defensive adaptations, the evidence for the violent overthrow of cities remains scant. There are no great burning layers at Mohenjo-daro or Harappa that point to a sacking. Mass graves with clear signs of battle trauma have not been found. The traumatic injuries observed on some skeletal remains are isolated and could stem from interpersonal conflict, accident, or judicial punishment, not necessarily from warfare. This lack of a smoking gun, a clear archaeological horizon of destruction, is a powerful argument against the theory of a single, catastrophic invasion that wiped the civilization out. So what does the presence of later fortifications tell us, if not of conquest? It points compellingly toward a rise in social tension, competition, and perhaps internal unrest. As resources like water and fertile land grew scarcer under climatic pressure, and as the unifying economic networks frayed, cooperation may have fractured. Communities or factions within them likely began to compete more directly for what remained. The new walls were not built against a foreign army storming from the northwest, but against a neighbor, a rival group, or simply the rising uncertainty of the age. They speak of a fragmentation of the old social contract, a move from collective civic identity toward more insular, protective localism. This was not a war from the outside in, but a fraying from the inside out. The greatest conflict may not have been fought with weapons, but in the slow, silent breakdown of trust that had once held a vast, peaceful network together. This was not a single disaster, but a slow-motion chain reaction. The modern explanation is not one of invasion or sudden flood, but of an interlocking crisis where environmental change triggered a cascade of failures across every pillar of society. Picture the civilization as a magnificent, ancient machine, its gears perfectly meshed for a world of predictable rains and open trade routes. Then, over centuries, the climate began to shift, a subtle but relentless change in the machine's fundamental fuel. The weakening monsoons meant less water flowing into the rivers and reservoirs. This was the first gear to grind, the agricultural foundation. Crop yields, especially for the water-intensive wheat and barley that fed the cities, began a long, slow decline. The once abundant surplus that allowed for specialists, administrators, and grand construction projects started to dwindle. Farmers, ever pragmatic, adapted by planting more drought-resistant millets, a brilliant move for family survival, but these crops generally produced less food per acre. The very act of adapting to save themselves gradually undermined the economic logic of the massive city. Feeding a metropolis of tens of thousands requires a huge, predictable surplus, and that was becoming mathematically impossible. This environmental pressure then seized the next gear, the brilliant water management systems. Those intricate networks of drains, wells, and check dams were engineering marvels, but they were also high maintenance. They required constant, coordinated labor to clean, dredge, and repair. As communities became more focused on securing their own food and water, the collective will to maintain this city-wide infrastructure faded. A clogged drain in a neighborhood became someone else's problem, until it was everyone's problem. The neglect we see archaeologically is not laziness. It is a tragic reallocation of energy from the communal to the personal. Meanwhile, the third critical gear, long-distance trade, was also seizing up. As Mesopotamia faced its own climate crises and political upheaval, the demand for Indus luxury goods evaporated. The ports grew quiet, and the raw materials like lapis lazuli and tin stopped flowing in. This erased a major source of wealth and status, making the urban centers, which were hubs for this trade, less attractive places to live. Why remain in a demanding city to practice a craft for a market that no longer exists? Here, the economic and social pressures fuse. The authority of whatever councils or guilds managed this complex society was built on their ability to deliver stability, water, food, and prosperity. As that ability faltered, their legitimacy likely eroded. People began to lose faith in the old social contract, the unspoken agreement that living in a grand, planned city was worth the effort and obedience it required. The response was not revolution, but quiet withdrawal. Families and kinship groups over generations made a rational choice to disperse toward the east and south, into regions with more reliable rain, or to simply move back into the countryside. They traded the vulnerabilities of a complex, centralized system for the resilience of smaller, self-sufficient communities. The civilization did not collapse, it decentralized. Its cultural knowledge, its farming techniques, and its craft skills were not lost. They were carried like seeds and sown across a wider landscape, where they would eventually take root in new forms. The great urban experiment ended not with a bang, but with 1,000 thoughtful, difficult goodbyes. Despite these breakthroughs, the Indus Valley still holds its secrets close. For every question answered, a deeper mystery comes into view, reminding us that history is not a puzzle to be solved, but a conversation that never truly ends. The most profound silence remains their unread script. Thousands of inscriptions survive, yet we cannot decipher a single word. This means we are missing their own voices, their names for their cities, their laws, their poetry, and their prayers. Without it, we can only infer their beliefs from symbols and architecture, leaving their spiritual world and its possible connections to later traditions in the realm of compelling speculation, not confirmed fact. Similarly, the precise nature of their social order continues to elude us. We see the results of incredible coordination in their city plans, but we cannot name the coordinators. Were they governed by a council of elders, a guild of merchants, or a class of priest technocrats? The absence of palaces and royal tombs suggests a unique political model, but its inner workings remain a tantalizing blank on our map of their world. Even the story of their dispersal, while clearer now, lacks fine detail. We know populations moved east and south, but tracing the exact routes and timelines of these migrations, understanding how countless communities chose their new homes, is a work in progress. These are not dead ends, but the very frontiers of modern research. Today, the story of the Indus is being rewritten not by lone adventurers, but by large, interdisciplinary teams. Archaeologists now work side by side with geneticists, climate scientists, geologists, and computer modelers. New excavations at sites like Rakhigarhi are applying every tool of 21st century science, from three-dimensional site mapping to soil chemistry analysis, to extract stories from the dust that earlier diggers could never see. Satellite archaeology scans vast landscapes from orbit, identifying potential sites hidden for millennia. Linguists and computer scientists employ complex algorithms in renewed attempts to crack the ancient script, searching for patterns that might finally reveal its linguistic structure. Each season in the field, each new lab result has the potential to shift our understanding. This transforms the narrative from a closed case into a living, breathing investigation. The abandonment of the cities was not an ending, but a turning point in a much longer story of human adaptation, a story we are only now beginning to read in full. What we are ultimately learning is that the true legacy of a civilization may not be in the monuments it leaves behind, but in the indelible mark it leaves on the future, a quiet echo in the genes, the languages, and the enduring spirit of a place. The story of the Indus Valley is a lesson in letting go of simple stories. We once searched for a single villain, a dramatic moment when everything fell apart. But the truth is far more profound and far more human. This was not a collapse but a transformation. Over centuries, a perfect storm of pressures, a changing climate, fraying trade, and eroding social consensus made the grand urban experiment unsustainable. The people did not vanish, they adapted. They dispersed, they changed their crops, they built new kinds of communities. Their brilliant urban model faded, but their knowledge and culture endured, flowing into the subcontinent's future. This is not a tale of failure, but of resilience, a civilization that chose a different path to survival. It reminds us that the end of a city is not the end of a people. In our own era of environmental uncertainty, their story asks us a vital question: what does true sustainability look like? Not just the endurance of stones and streets, but the flexibility of human spirit. The Indus legacy is a whisper from the past, urging us to think not in terms of permanence, but of intelligent, graceful adaptation. What other ancient wisdom is waiting to be uncovered? Subscribe to stay connected as new discoveries continue to rewrite our deepest history.